Welcome to my channel Daily Bulletin News. Steve learns the truth about Abigail, and, spoiler, saves Sarah from Fiona. At the hospital, Steve talks with Chad over the phone. He says he heard Chad took Abigail to Paris. Chad explains he's hoping it will stir up some memories, but nothing concrete has come up yet. Chad suspects Steve is still suspicious of Abby, which is why he's calling. Steve says he's concerned about him, but Chad insists he's fine and that he and Abby are getting married. Chad relays that Abby remembered their vows, she remembered how happy they were that day, and she suggested getting married could cause her to remember more. Steve admits he has questions, and Chad should too. Chad says he's getting married and will give Abby Steve's best wishes, and hangs up. In the streets of Paris, Holly catches Abigail on the phone talking to Mark, who is at the hospital. She says she's about to get married to Chad, she knows the stakes, and this is all for Mom. Mark says he just saw Clyde, and there is something else he wants him to do. Suddenly, Abigail realizes Holly is watching her. Holly calls her Abigail. Abby tells Mark she has to go and hangs up. Holly introduces herself and explains she is here because her mom lives in Paris. Holly says she didn't mean to eavesdrop but just heard her say she was getting married. Abigail says it was a spur-of-a-moment decision. Holly, confused, says she mentioned getting married because of her mother. Abigail says she was talking to her brother JJ about their mom having difficulty accepting her as her daughter. Abigail hopes getting married again will trigger her memories, and then her mother will accept her. Abigail says it was nice running into her, but she needs to go find a dress to get married in. Holly asks to come with her. Abigail returns to her suite with Chad, and surprises him with Holly. Chad and Holly hug each other, and she explains she came to visit her mom and was planning to get a hotel room. Chad insists she stays with them. He says they need a witness for the wedding, and Abigail needs a maid of honor. Chad gets Holly settled and returns to Abigail. Chad promises her tomorrow will be the perfect day as they are getting married. They embrace. Back at the hospital, Mark thinks it's good that Abigail hung up as he doesn't know how to tell her that Clyde wants him to kill Chad. Suddenly, Steve appears. Mark asks him if there is something he needs. Steve explains he was looking for him, introduces himself as Kayla's husband, and says his wife speaks highly of him. He needs a favor regarding the DNA test on his niece and wants him to rerun it. He says his family is having trouble accepting the results, so a second test could give them peace of mind. Mark agrees to rerun the tests, so Steve gives him some new samples from Abigail and Thomas. Mark says he'll put a rush on it and heads to the lab. Later, Mark returns and tells Steve that the results are conclusive and that Thomas and Abigail are a perfect DNA match. Steve thanks Mark. Mark leaves, and Steve jokes, who would have guessed Kayla and I are mother and son? He realizes Mark faked the results, and that woman is not Abigail. Outside the Brady pub, Xander tells Maggie that Kristen has a cure for Sarah's paralysis thanks to Dr. Rolfe. Xander explains that Kristen is willing to give it to them for the charges against Brady being dropped. Maggie calls Kristen delusional, and they can't get the charges dropped as they aren't the DA. Xander points out that Sarah's testimony is all EJ has, and EJ says if Sarah changes her statement, he'll charge her with perjury. EJ is that bent on seeing Brady in prison. He says Brady is going to prison, Sarah may never walk again, and it's all his fault. Maggie asks how this is his fault. Xander explains Sarah doesn't remember Brady hitting her and lied to the police to stop him from killing Brady. Xander cries he wanted justice for Sarah, and when she learned what he was planning to do, Sarah lied to the police. Xander explains his plan to Maggie. Maggie cries that she told him nothing good would come from his need for revenge. Xander says thanks to him, Brady will be locked up, and Sarah will never get the cure. Xander asks if she hates him. Maggie says she could never hate him, but he is his own worst enemy, and his need for revenge hurts him and the people he loves. Maggie says she'll talk to Kristen, and maybe she can convince her to give Sarah this cure. Xander thinks she's always fixing problems that he creates. Maggie tells him she is doing this for Sarah and walks off. At the police station, Eric tells Brady they need to talk about Fiona. Brady swears he didn't know who Fiona was when he met her, and they were both in bad places. Eric doesn't care about that and asks if Fiona was drinking that night. Brady admits she was. Eric suggests Fiona was driving that night and placed him in the driver's seat. Brady calls Eric's idea wild speculation, but Eric begs him to search his brain. Brady begins to recall the accident and realizes Fiona was driving. Brady tells Eric he remembers Fiona was behind the wheel, and he heard her say that she thought she hit someone. Brady says, "I didn't do it, I didn't hit Sarah. I'm innocent." In her room at the Kuriaki's mansion, Sarah recalls seeing Fiona behind the wheel the night she was hit. Suddenly, Fiona enters the room, and Sarah says, "It was you. I finally remember who was driving that night. It was you." Fiona tells Sarah she's confused, and where would she get such an idea? Sarah tells her that Eric told her that she was with Brady the night of the accident, and they were drinking at the bar. Fiona admits she was with Brady that night, but that doesn't mean she had anything to do with her accident. She admits she kept it a secret as she didn't want Xander to know she was with Brady because of the bad blood between them. Fiona swears she tried to convince Brady not to drive that night, and Eric is desperate to save his brother and is putting ideas in her head. Sarah says she knows it was Fiona and to admit it. Fiona asks why Sarah is doing this, as she never had a clear memory of what happened that night before. Sarah says she does now, but Fiona says this is the power of suggestion, thanks to Brady's brother. Sarah assumes Fiona was drinking too. Sarah is sick of her stonewalling and says she's calling Xander. Fiona snatches her phone, and says she can't call Xander as she'll lose her son. Sarah doesn't give a damn. Fiona vents that Sarah has no idea how lonely she was, and now she finally has her son and a family. Fiona swears it was an accident. She admits she was drinking, but Brady was so much worse, and she thought she was doing the right thing. She cries that she never meant to hurt her, and she took her eyes off the road for 1 second. She says she was horrified when she hit her, but she heard Xander coming and knew she'd be okay, which is why she left. Fiona insists she hates herself for what she's done. Sarah snaps, "Not enough to frame Brady for what you did." Fiona swears she didn't want Brady to go to prison and didn't know he'd turn himself in. She thought Brady would be in the clear, but Sarah went and identified him. Sarah tells her she did that to save Xander, and now Brady will spend 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Sarah doesn't care if EJ puts her in prison for perjury and says she will tell everyone what Fiona did. Fiona tells her, "I'm sorry, dear, I just can't let you do that." Fiona begins to push Sarah's chair towards the stairs and says she's very sorry, but she's about to have a terrible accident. Sarah tries to fight her off, but Fiona says Xander will find her at the bottom of the stairs and they will think she lost control of her chair and no one will be the wiser. Suddenly, Xander appears, stops his mother, and says, "Except for me." Stay tuned and subscribe the channel.